I did talk about it at the beginning, the Magnitsky Act. Maybe we could just start, Martin, with a little introduction to this, because it is the legislation which enables an arbitrary targeting of specific individuals, this has a massive chilling effect. And I think this is one of the things that's not discussed anywhere in any of the mainstream press, is the idea that you may travel to Britain and then you may be named under the British Magnitsky Act or the US Magnitsky Act, and you're travelling to the United States. That can mean your visa is instantly rescinded, and that your assets are all confiscated. Any of your assets in that country are confiscated. A little bit like, it reminds me a little bit about what happened to Meng Wanzhou, the Huawei chief financial officer. When she went to Canada, suddenly this completely unexpected thing happened to her, and she's imprisoned. And now apparently she's going to be extradited to the United States, although I'm not sure the Canadians will really dare to do that. It's an absolutely reckless thing to do. And it's caused all sorts of trouble, obviously, in Hong Kong as well. And the fallout from that, the knock-on effects have been horrendous for 7 million people who live in Hong Kong. Just that one act of the Canadians arresting and then saying they're going to pass her on. But anyway, the Magnitsky Act has this effect. The idea it really being to stop anybody with wealthy and powerful in Russia from actually travelling anywhere into Western countries where this act is in effect.
Yeah, and if you look at the Magnitsky case, Bill Browder, who's the billionaire behind all of this, Magnitsky was basically defrauding the Russian tax office, and the Browder, who one of his business partners, paid Russian journalists to produce a documentary about it. And this Russian journalist went off to produce a documentary about what had happened to Magnitsky, having been directed by the financer of the project that Magnitsky was innocent and that the Russians had set him up and so on. And then he concluded that Magnitsky wasn't innocent and that the Russians were right and that he was basically a fraudster. And, of course, that documentary has been suppressed. But I think we could probably put a link up to on our show page. I'm sure it's out there. And on the back of this, which is essentially fraudulent, both the US and Britain have now had Magnitsky Acts, which allow them to just designate any foreign person, or even presumably a British person, as being a human rights abuser, etc., and therefore their assets can be seized and they can be imprisoned and so on, without any court of law.
That's right.
No process, nothing.
There is no process whatsoever. You just are named by the government and closed down, effectively. The British Magnitsky Act was passed in May 2018, just after the Skripal affair. So that's another thing that, if you're scratching your head wondering what that was all about, it was about making sure this act took place in Britain. So let's have a listen now to Alex Krainer. I spoke to him earlier this week. He's the author of a book called The Grand Deception, The Truth About Bill Browder, the Magnitsky Act and Anti-Russia Sanctions, and that was published in 2018. And I think you'll find this is a long interview, but it includes a fascinating section about the Epsteins and some of the totally unreported facts to do with the court case that's going on between Epstein's banker and Deutsche Bank, I believe, the people who were financing Epstein. So they're trying to find out where the money was going, where it was going to and from, and suddenly people start dying who are supposed to be appearing in court, and the judges who are supposed to be presiding over cases get threatened, and there's an attempts to murder them. So this is a quite wide-ranging interview, really, looking at UK, US, Russia relations, but particularly explaining how this Magnitsky Act works with Alex Krainer I did earlier this week.
I'm Alex Krainer. I'm a former hedge fund manager. I'm a market analyst and commodities trader based in Monaco, originally from Croatia. I have published 2 books and 1 article in a peer-reviewed journal, and one of the books has been banned, deleted from Amazon at the request of one Jonathan Weiner, who was the advisor of John Kerry in the Obama administration, from the State Department. And the book was about Bill Browder and the Magnitsky Act, which has been widely described as the opening salvo of the new Cold War between the United States and Russia. So that's basically where I'm at and the things that I've been interesting myself with over the.
Okay, I think we're hearing a lot at the moment in the UK about Magnitsky Act. Can we start, please, with who was Magnitsky? What was his first name? Who was he? And who is this Bill Browder guy?
We're talking about Sergei Magnitsky. Sergei Magnitsky was the employee of the Moscow-based law firm called Firestone and Duncan, which was established by one Jamie Firestone. This company worked for Bill Browder's Hermitage Capital, which used to be the largest foreign-owned hedge fund in Russia. It was managed by Bill Browder. Bill Browder is a former American, now British subject because he changed his citizenship. Very likely an MI6 asset, and he was the man at the center of events that generated the narrative with which the Magnitsky Act had been lobbied through U.S. Congress in 2012. Again, I'll repeat, the Magnitsky Act is considered as the opening salvo of the new Cold War between the United States and Russia. This passed in 2012 during the Obama administration.
How can it be part of a Cold War? This is just about economics and about money.
Yes and no. Basically, the Magnitsky Act ostensibly is a piece of legislation that protects human rights and punishes the human rights abusers. But this is merely the facade. In reality, the act sanctions Russian individuals or firms who have been who are seen to have been involved in human rights abuses. The nature of the legislation is problematic because it does not involve any due process. So basically what happens is that some unnamed and unknown individual, some bureaucrat from the United States Treasury Department, at their discretion, can put Tony Gosling on the Magnitsky list. From that point on, Tony Gosling's U.S. assets and any bank accounts in the United States will be frozen, and you will no longer be able to travel to the United States, and you will have no recourse, no possibility to confront your accusers, no possibility of knowing what you're being accused of, or to be able to clear your name again. So the question is, why these bizarre punishments for people who are merely accused of abusing human rights? My own explanation is, because I have looked into this in some detail, and I've pondered the problem a little bit. My explanation is that basically we have to go back to the 1990s. What happened in the 1990s is that Russia transitioned from a communist economy to capitalist economy. So you were right, we're coming back to money, but it has broader ramification than just some amount of money over some individual business deal or interest. Basically, what happened is that during this transition in Russia from communism to capitalism, the Western financial interests have been able to spirit away from Russia to offshore centers, conservatively between $200 billion and $600 billion worth of Russia's wealth. These are conservative estimates. It could have been very much higher, and we're not talking about market cap in a bloated stock market. We're talking book value of assets, right? So this is extremely large amount.
Okay,
now,
so the context of this is, you had the oligarchs going around in Russia in the 1990s under Yeltsin, buying up quite cheap a lot of the massive state assets. And of course, as a communist country, there were all sorts of major industries controlled by the government, and those were often foreign interests. So I suppose the idea really there is that they would buy these assets up and then keep those assets abroad rather than within Russia, because they felt, particularly in the 1990s, they may have been right, that Russia wasn't a very safe place to keep their money.
Well, yeah, especially if you're stealing it, because various mechanisms were used to plunder Russia's wealth. But basically, one of the biggest chunks of this was to place the key jewels of Russian economy into the hands of a hand-picked, recruited group of oligarchs. They have been recruited well in advance and groomed for this role by Western financial interests. I think virtually all of them from the Komsomol, which was the youth organization of the Russian Communist Party. So these were all sons of communist functionaries of the Russian.
So, you say well beforehand. How far beforehand? Because that make you suspect that there were a whole bunch of people ready and waiting to pounce, and that it was all understood that the glasnost was going to happen and that the communism was going to fall.
Well, there have been, and unfortunately I can't give you the name now, but there have been trips and meetings and pre-arrangements between the Western financial interests and the Soviet authorities going back into the 70s at the very least. So the banking reforms started well ahead of the glasnost. The banking reforms which enabled these oligarchs and other entrepreneurs to register private banks in Russia with as little as $100,000 in capital and in how do you call it? In the founding capital, and virtually with no regulation whatsoever. So there was some banking regulation that was introduced, but it was really not being abided by very strictly, and essentially anybody who could walk in with $100,000 could create a bank in the Soviet Union already before the transition.
Okay, so how does all this with the oligarchs buying up all this state assets, how does this relate to come round to Magnitsky? Because that all started around about 1980. There was a collapse, for people that don't know or don't remember or weren't alive. There was the massive collapse around about 1990 in the Russian economy, and the 1990s were really the Yeltsin era. Most of them were the Yeltsin era, and Yeltsin was really allowing a free hand for the oligarchs to do what they wanted until the end of the 1990s, the arrival 2000 of Vladimir Putin. So how does what's happened with Magnitsky and the timing of that fit in with the plunder of Russia?
Okay, so that's exactly the right question. Basically, and this has been my hypothesis, but I've already come across several people that agree with me on this, and then certain other experiences that are related to this also corroborate this hypothesis. And my hypothesis basically is that once all this wealth, once the ownership over all these key assets disappeared from Russia to various offshore jurisdictions, what happened when Putin came to power is he wanted to reverse some of these transfers of wealth, and so his government started to investigate the transfers of wealth, all these transactions, and to trace the assets where they went, so that they may be able to recover them. Now, to do this, you can investigate in Russia what happened in Russia, but then to be able to investigate the transactions as they went offshore, you need to go through the jurisdictions like London and New York and the Cayman Islands and Cyprus and so forth, and Switzerland. And so in order to investigate all this, you would eventually have to go to these foreign jurisdictions. You would have to file various lawsuits, freedom of information requests, and so forth. And this is a very, very important part of the process, because if you go through the legitimate judicial process, then what happens is that various participants in this and various witnesses to this are going to be interviewed and deposed, and official documents are going to be taken out, and basically the whole affair comes out black on white on record, and then you cannot reverse it anymore, and you cannot hide it anymore. And so the further you allow these investigations to go on, the closer the process gets to the culprits of the great plunder of Russia in the 1990s. And so my view is that there is this rush to introduce Magnitsky legislature in all the key Western jurisdictions, exactly in order to frustrate this process, so that the Russian investigators cannot trace back the assets to their ultimate beneficiaries. So that, like if somebody wants to conduct an investigation, they can immediately be placed on the Magnitsky list. At that point, they can no longer travel. The witnesses can no longer travel. And now, one of the people who have agreed with me when I discussed this with her was Natalia Veselnitskaya, who is a Moscow-based lawyer and who did have some run-ins with Bill Browder and the Russiagate affair. But then, since over the last few years, we've already seen that, for example, when the International Criminal Court in The Hague wanted to investigate certain U.S. and Israeli persons for suspicion of war crimes, that Mike Pompeo said that they would rescind their visas, that they would deny them visas for the United States. So this is obviously seen as a handy mechanism to frustrate certain judicial processes from running their course and reaching their full conclusions.
So the Magnitsky Act was passed in 2012 in the United States. In
Correct.
The UK, there was an equivalent act passed. And you do wonder if this is just because Britain is now part of the US empire. In May 2018, just after the Skripal affair. So Sergei Skripal and Yulia Skripal were apparently gassed with some nerve agent in Salisbury, although there were various different people say different things about that whole affair. As a former BBC reporter in Salisbury for a year myself, I'm extremely sceptical about the official version of events there, knowing that, for example, that the Chief Constable of Wiltshire Police, it was his first day in his new job because the previous guy, who'd been extremely good, had been removed, scapegoated effectively. So the new guy didn't have any real experience policing Wiltshire when this event happened. It was his first day. Plus, there are lots of anomalies in that account, not least of which is this apparent perfume bottle and some apparent confusion between whether this was a professional outfit, if these so-called Russian agents were having sex with prostitutes, smoking cannabis, and this sort of thing. And there's a great deal of contention about what really happened in Salisbury. And then the other thing is, of course, that Sergei Skripal was involved with Christopher Steele in creating this Russia dossier in order to try and make out that President Trump had been using Russian help in order to get elected. And his biggest crime, it seems, of Skripal to me is that he was then considering and wrote a letter to Vladimir Putin saying that he wanted to actually now to return to Russia. He got fed up with Britain. He didn't trust the Brits anymore. And at which point suddenly this incident happens. And, of course, he's not going back to Russia now. The British may have been very concerned that he was going to appear on Russian TV, etc., talking about how MI6 had been working with him and Christopher Steele to fabricate a whole dossier of evidence about Russia and Trump. But anyway, look, the point being here is that this was the reason used in Britain to impose this Magnitsky Act here. So what do you make of that, Britain sort of falling in straight into line then with the United States a few years later, 6 years later in May 2018?
Well, I think that the way certain key legislature is being passed in the Western jurisdiction is not clearly a transparent above-board process. I think that when a certain act has to pass, there are ways to pressure the lawmakers in every nation and to make.
I suppose that if the British are desperate at the moment for a trade deal with the United States, that might be a bit of leverage that would persuade the British to say, yes, we'll do this deal, this act, pass this Magnitsky Act.
Yes, but I suspect that there's worse than that, because I suspect that there are control files on key decision makers in the whole hierarchy of the establishment. And that these control files can be used to lean on these decision makers to make the right decisions, to vote the right way, and to make laws pass that need to be passed. And so, we've seen we've seen this kind of stuff again and again. When the decision needs to be made to go and run over Libya, there's hardly any debate about that. There's clearly illegitimate aspects to the process, and the Magnitsky Acts are very, very important to cover up the tracks of the great plunder of Russia in the 1990s. So, by whatever means, by hook or by crook, there's ways to lean on the lawmakers to vote the right way and to make these legislature pass. There's also the process that sometimes you insert things into certain laws that most the legislator want to see passed, right? The pork barrel spending kind of laws, and you package it together with the Magnitsky sanction, and then everybody said okay, well, let's pass this so we can get all these other goodies. So there are many different ways that certain laws can be obtained, not above board, not in a transparent way, but effectively they do become the law, and then the administration and the bureaucracy can act in accordance. And then a certain process that would need to be completed, i.e. these Russian investigations into the plunder of the 1990s, can no longer be completed, and they're completely frustrated at the root.
Well, the British Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, says if you're a kleptocrat or an organised criminal, you won't be able to launder your money in the City of London anymore.
Well, that sounds like a solemn declaration, but I would take it with a giant grain of salt, because when it comes to money, this adherence to human rights and to morality is just disingenuous and untrue. We've seen, for example, in 2012 also that, for example, HSBC has been completely let off the hook with a small parking ticket after they have been caught laundering at least $7 billion for the Mexican drug cartels. That's, how is laundering money for the Mexican drug cartels better than laundering money for Russian oligarchs? I mean, why is one category morally superior to the other?
The Magnitsky Act has also been mentioned this week in the Russian election interference report, which has come out from the Parliament's Intelligence and Security Committee. They've said that Britain has badly underestimated the threat to British elections from Russia.
Well, Russia has been generally blamed for every bad thing happening in the West, but to me it makes very little sense. It's a constant thing. Russia has been blamed for undermining people's unity on the issue of vaccinations. They've been blamed for the downing of the Malaysia airliner over Ukraine. They've been blamed for the election of Donald Trump, for Brexit, for the Skripal poisoning. They've been blamed for sending agents to the Czech Republic to assassinate Czech politicians because the They voted in favor of removing some Soviet-era monument. And the list just goes on and on and on. Basically, anything bad that can sour public perception of Russia gets a great deal of media attention and practically like a public relations push. So I am very skeptical about it. I don't see Russia as this great global villain that does all these bad things while all the other countries are just like well-behaved children who never do anything wrong. So everything bad is obviously to be blamed on Russia. I think there are reasons why it is very important to the Western establishment to maintain a hostile stance towards Russia. There's more than one reason. I will give you the two main ones that I see. One is that we have a financial system that's like an inverted pyramid with a very, very small base and with a very, very large base and a very, very small tip. Okay, and it's going to implode. Western financial system requires healthy collateral in order to grow, right? Russia is an enormously resource-rich country. They have 16% debt to GDP. So if Western financial interests could gain financial control over this resource wealth in Russia, that collateral would give a new lease of life to the Western financial system. So removing the Putin regime, which is pushing back, and putting in some other kind of regime like the Yeltsin regime that would enable Western financial interests to take control over Russia's wealth, is one important reason why there's the hostile stance towards the Putin regime. The other one is that one of the most powerful segments of our society is our military-industrial complex, not just in the United States, but in France, in the United Kingdom, even in Germany. And for this military-industrial complex to continue building their societies and their population for more and more and more untold billions and trillions, we need to have an enemy. Why should we be buying all these fighter jets and all these rockets and ships and God knows what, and building all these military bases everywhere if we have no enemy? Like, if we can cooperate constructively with Russia, trade, travel back and forth, and develop, let's say, civilian business, butter versus guns, then we don't need so many weapons, right? We don't need to buy all these weapons and support all these military contractors, right? So it's extremely important to have an enemy. So the public image of Russia has to be maintained as some aggressive, nasty power that we have to constantly be on the lookout against, and that is always a threat to us. So we always have to prepare for a big fight and a big war. So that's two very, very important reasons why maintaining hostile stance towards Russia is very, very important to the Western financial and corporate establishment.
So what happened? How did Putin manage to get in 2000 if he was going to completely turn the tables on the international financial system? I mean, that sounds to me as if it was an incredible operation he managed there. How did he do it?
Okay, this is partly a mystery to me, and I have tried very hard to understand how he got in power. And it's a very, very interesting story. In many dimensions, it's very mysterious. He somehow ended up being friends with Henry Kissinger, among other people, because his boss in St. Petersburg. So he was an aide to St. Petersburg Mayor Anatoly Sobchak, right? And Anatoly Sobchak was apparently a Henry Kissinger loyalist. So Vladimir Putin became known and noted by Henry Kissinger and probably other powerful people in the West. Over the years, Vladimir Putin has done some work where he helped the Yeltsin family avoid legal liabilities for some corruption affairs that started to emerge. late towards towards Boris Yeltsin's presidency. And so in this way, he gained the confidence of these powerful people and of the oligarchs. So the biggest oligarch at the time was Boris Berezovsky, who later ended up defecting to London. But Boris Berezovsky himself was very keen on bringing Vladimir Putin to become first the prime minister and then eventually to replace Boris Yeltsin. And having reviewed Boris Berezovsky's statements, he believed that he would be able to run the country by basically having Vladimir Putin there as a figurehead and then running the show in the background while Vladimir Putin passively enjoys his life of eating and fishing and golfing as a figurehead president. How Vladimir Putin and people around him managed to persuade these people that this would be possible, I don't know, but it seems to me that there was a network of clever people from the KGB who helped out, who networked and made all this happen. And I think one of them is gone now. His name is going to escape me, but he died recently. He used to be the chief of the KGB. God forgive me, I just forget his name now. But he founded one of the political parties with the Moscow mayor Yuri Lushkov. So the old.
Okay, well that's fascinating. I mean, I know I was reading recently that Berezovsky and Putin in the early 1990s were off having skiing trips in Switzerland, and they were very, personally very friendly. So, what you say makes a lot of sense. How do you think this is going to all play out, though? Because this is the big question about the Magnitsky Acts in the US and in Britain is if it does mean that you've got a complete cut-off with some of the most powerful and wealthiest people in Russia from the rest of the world, and they're not allowed to investigate or get back any of their assets. You've got 49 people, Dominic Raab now has said, are on the British Magnitsky list. These are specific individuals. As you say, they're just named, and then from that moment on, their assets are seized. They can't travel to Britain, etc. One does wonder what would happen if they were named as a Magnitsky Act person whilst they were abroad. Of course, just the fact that you might be put on that list would mean that you would very, very unlikely to want to travel to Britain. So it has an immense, which is completely unspoken about, immense chilling effect on relations between the nations. I mean, it does seem as if we're heading down the line here towards some much more serious conflict if they're prepared to take measures like this, Alex.
Yes. There's a great deal of moral hazard with this Magnitsky legislature. It is designed to protect a narrow group of vested interest in the I would say in the Western financial circles, to the detriment of ordinary people and businessmen who might see much better interest in, let's say, cooperating and trading with Russia, in exporting their wares, on buying Russian products and selling them. So it's bad for the most people. It's only good for those who have participated in the pirate raid on Russia in the 1990s. How this plays out, I am not sure. It is very clear that the Russians are extremely persistent, that they are very scrupulous and careful not to discredit themselves by doing things like the Skripal affair. I do not believe for a second that they poisoned the Skripals in Salisbury. I believe that they are very careful to go through the legitimate judicial process, because whatever victories you score in that way cannot easily be reversed. Whereas if you do something bad under below board, let's say, this only serves to harm your interest in the longer term. I think that they will be persisting in this. I think that from their side they will continue conducting investigations and putting pressures on other governments in various ways to participate with them. For example, with the government of Cyprus, with the government of Spain, and probably more in the intelligence collecting ways in places like Bermuda, Cayman Islands, British Virgin Islands, and so what, to continue to collect documentary evidence of what happened to their assets in the 1990s. At the same time, I think that Russia wants to, in a real way, counter the Western Empire. You say it's American Empire. I think it's not necessarily American Empire. I think it's more British Empire that has taken the United States as its military muscles since the end of World War I. But regardless, this is an empire that has its vested interests. I think their headquarters in the city of London, and that the sub-headquarters are on Wall Street. And I think that they are following strictly the logic of empire of having to eliminate every rival. And I think that at this time, their house of cards is starting to implode. So they're acting in more and more reckless ways. And I think that they're endangering themselves further because the time is running out for them. I think that one of the very interesting battles that are emerging there are related to Jeffrey Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell affair, and now the court case against Deutsche Bank for laundering money for Jeffrey Epstein. We have seen already that Jeffrey Epstein's private banker has committed suicide. We have seen that somebody sent an assassin to the house of judge who was assigned this case against Deutsche Bank. And this to me, because, assassination is very, very serious affairs. I remember years ago I watched a lecture of a KGB defector in the United States from the 1980s. His name was Yuri Bezmenov. He was explaining that even KGB is extremely reluctant to do assassinations. And he explained that the reason is because when you decide to kill somebody, you have to kill actually 3 people. You have to kill your target, you have to kill the assassin, and then you have to kill the assassin. And all of this is necessary to completely cover your tracks. And now we have already seen that the assassin who was sent to this judge's house had already been assassinated. So they've already done 2 assassinations. Well, they haven't killed the judge, but they botched it, and they killed her son and critically injured her husband. Her name now escapes me, but then the suspected assassin, was found dead also, apparently of suicide with 2 gunshots to the head. And so the fact that the powers that be have resorted to these kinds of measures tells me that the crosshairs are very close to the target, and that they're getting extremely nervous. I believe that in addition to let's say Russian government being a rival for power to this empire builders network, I think that the Trump administration is also opposed to this network, because it seems to me that Trump administration has been putting pressures on them with arresting Jeffrey Epstein, with arresting Ghislaine Maxwell, with starting these court cases against Deutsche Bank and so forth. So I think that they are in trouble. I think that the walls are closing in around them, and they're resorting to increasingly desperate measures. So I think it's been getting interesting, and I think it's going to continue to get even more interesting, but God only knows how it plays out, and I think it will be very difficult to predict what's going to happen. I only hope that we will be able to avoid the hot war between the Western powers and China, or Russia, or both, because I think that would be extremely, extremely destructive, and the world will never be the same.
Well, that's interesting. You mentioned Kissinger earlier, because he has some very strong connections both in China and in the United States. Yes,
of course, and in Russia as well. There are always these networks of powerful people who are not necessarily, you cannot treat any nation as a monolith. You always have, take Russia, you'll have part of the power network who are, let's call it, deplorable patriotic Russians. And then you have the Euro-Atlanticists who are more loyal to London and New York, who will keep friendships with people like Henry Kissinger and George Soros and so forth, and who will be running the media for them and their open society foundations and so forth. You probably have the same situation in China, and you have probably the same situation in the United States as well as Britain, perhaps. And so I think that what we're seeing now is a bit of a civil war between these interests among themselves, possibly in China. And unfortunately, I don't know very much about the internal Chinese politics, but definitely in Russia and definitely in the United States. And I think that these internal conflicts will determine how these countries fall in line or not with respect to the empire.
I mean, certainly the most interesting stuff you've been talking about is Epstein. You're also saying, though, aren't you, that you think that the City of London is still kind of at the centre, that they're telling the Americans what to do. I think there's a lot of people in the UK that feel that the Americans are telling us what to do, but maybe it's just the City telling the Americans, who then tell the rest of Britain what to do. But the other question, of course, is that there's a very close link, quite clearly, between the Maxwell family and Epstein and the Israelis. So where do the Israelis fit in? Because we're looking at basically organised crime networks that are centred around those three countries.
Well, I think that for all practical purposes, you can see all these. You can take Israel as part of the Western establishment, right? And I think that in the Western establishment, all the intelligence agencies cooperate on certain things together, right? So German intelligence, Israeli intelligence, Italian intelligence, British intelligence, Australia, New Zealand, Sweden, Spain, France, and the United States and Canada.
NATO.
They all form intelligence networks that closely cooperate. I'll give you an example. When Croatia joined the NATO, one of the preconditions was that NATO, in certain important segments, NATO takes over control over Croatia's intelligence services, right? So, if something need be done in Croatia or on Croatian assets or laws or whatever you have, then they will find a network of people who will be able to cooperate with them. And I think that the same is true for Mossad, for French intelligence services, and so forth. It's all in the same network. And something you mentioned moments ago that I wanted to come back to, I forgot. Forgive me. So we'll just move on.
Okay. So I just wanted to see whether you think that Maxwell, who's certainly her father, was known to be very closely connected to the Israeli Secret Service. I mean, how does that fit in? Because there's a lot of discussion on the surface about this whole Ghislaine Maxwell, Jeffrey Epstein business, but it seems pretty obvious that there was a purpose for what they were doing. Effectively, it was a blackmail operation. They were bringing powerful people in, having them filmed on the aircraft, in the various houses, etc., and that they now have a great big hard drive full of films of powerful people with young kids, teenagers, etc. I just wonder what you think, where that hard drive is. Is it in a nutshell? I don't know whether it matters. Is it in London, Tel Aviv, or Washington?
That's a very good question. You know what? My hunch would be in Washington. That would be my hunch, but I could be wrong. But this whole affair with Maxwell and Epstein is going back to, moments ago we were talking about these powerful networks being able to lean on decision makers to make the right decisions in order to pass these kinds of legislations like Magnitsky Act, by way of having control files. And I forgot, I didn't explain what I mean by control files, but basically, if you have evidence of somebody's wrongdoing, for example, engaging in illicit sex act or receiving bribery or so forth, then you can influence them to do your bidding in the legislature, in courts, or wherever it need be. So this is what I meant by the control files, and very possibly the work of Robert Maxwell, of his daughter Ghislaine Maxwell, and Jeffrey Epstein has been to generate these control files, right? And I think that the panic about this is exactly that the wrong people will gain control of these control files, and I suspect that to an extent this has already happened. And I think that if you see the things that have been happening in the FBI, like Donald Trump has been able to take control over the FBI, where when he joined the administration, when he came to the White House, the FBI was completely under control of the Obama-era loyalists, which are, I think, people who are loyal to the globalist empire rather than deplorable patriotic Americans. And I think that the other agencies that he has to wrestle control of are the national security agencies, the Treasury Department, the Judicial Department, and the Pentagon, and the CIA, of course. And I think that gaining these control files will accelerate let's call it the deplorable segment of the U.S. administration to gain control of these key agencies.
Yeah, one of the interesting things is, of course, on that hard drive will almost be a control file on Donald Trump, which might have, maybe excited him to make sure that was in his hands rather than some foreign powers. But look, I mean, I've worked, in mainstream press in the BBC in London, Alex. You've worked in doing hedge fund managing. Can you just give us, from your experience, doing the, quite high-level financial operation, for ordinary folks out there who've never really been part of this world, how the world really works in a nutshell?
Well, I think that the skeleton of the society today is its financial system, because everything depends on the financial system, right? We're going into slightly philosophical realm here, but we are all born into this world which is astonishingly abundant, right? There's great abundance everywhere around us. If you look at you look around yourself, you see the houses, the apartments, the cars, the airplanes, the yachts, the amount of food that we eat and that we waste and so forth is just phenomenal, right? 100 years ago, we were less than 1 billion. Today, we are allegedly more than 7 billion. Still, most people eat. So there's this great abundance that's nourishing us. The problem is that most of us have no access to this abundance, because the ticket to this abundance is the money, right? So you can't just have a roof over your head and food in your belly. You have to pay for it. And to pay for it, you need money. And somebody controls the money. And they say, no, you cannot have this unless you can pay for it with dollars or pounds or euros or what have you. You cannot just give somebody a haircut in exchange for a meal, right? I mean, you can, but it's, strictly speaking, is discouraged, and in many ways it's illegal. So to get access to this abundance, you need money. So we are all dependent on money, and we all need to do what we need to do to earn this money. And so these are the chains. These are the chains that are restricting our liberty, that are restricting our access to the livelihood, to the comforts of life, to the joys of life. And the system has ways of always putting pressure on us, making it always harder and harder to earn the money to make a living. And now we've come to the point where it's become so hard and the system is so over-leveraged with debt that something will break and something is breaking. And the people who are controlling this system, right? And this is essentially a franchise based in the City of London. So other central banks are basically franchise of this central bank, which is the Bank of England. They want to clear the deck. They want to start over, but while preserving the power structure as it is and the control in their own hands. The way this has been done traditionally is through world wars. This time around, they're having a difficult time getting a war going, but they have proven themselves to be very, very persistent in this way as well. So, they try to get a skirmish going on between India and Pakistan, between Russia and Ukraine, between Greece and Turkey, between Venezuela and Colombia, between, you name it, Saudi Arabia and Yemen, Saudi Arabia and Iran and so forth. So anywhere where they can throw a spark, they try. And I don't know, this time around it doesn't seem to be working, but we still have to be on the lookout. And I think that we still have to be very careful not to find ourselves in World War III, because once the war gets going, I promise you everything changes. Today we can have a nuanced discussion about the Russians and about the Chinese and about the Americans and the empire and so forth. Once the war gets going, the society polarizes very quickly. And then you're with us or you're against us. Political dissent is tantamount to treason. And everybody has to line up behind their government, whether they like it or not. So I think that the way to do this is to make sure that the truth is accessible to the people, that people can discuss in terms of truthful information rather than in terms of lies and propaganda. And hopefully the great majority of the population will not have the stomach for war, and we can avoid it.
Fascinating, Alex Krainer. Thanks ever so much for joining us.
Tony, thank you very much for having me, and all the best to you and to your listeners.
So that's Alex Krainer there, talking to me from Croatia earlier this week. Kind of a unique guy, really, Martin, in that although he's worked in these financial circles, he's almost like a kind of gamekeeper turned poacher. He's now very critical of a lot of high finance, and even though he's still actually working in it, and particularly of Bill Browder and this Magnitsky Act, which it turns out it's actually an extremely political move, and it's almost extrajudicial. The idea that some official somewhere can just write someone's name down on a piece of paper and all their assets are seized. It does sort of go. Doesn't it sniff to you a bit of extrajudicial process here?
Well, definitely. These things have always been going on, but it's intensifying because of the nature of the crisis. A Marxist would say that it's because of the falling rate of profit and all the rest of it underlying things. But that's a pretty comprehensive view of what's going on.
One of the big revelations we've got there, he was fantastic that he covered this, basically a news story this week that we might otherwise have covered, but he covered it for us. And this is the appointment last Wednesday, the 15th of July, 2020, of the judge, Esther Salas, on the court case to do with the Deutsche Bank and Jeffrey Epstein's bank accounts. And that happened on the Sunday. On the Wednesday, a FedEx person turned up, very much like that film, The 3 Days of the Condor, if you've ever seen that, with Robert Redford. If you haven't, you should. Terrific film from the 1970s. A man from FedEx turns up at the door, and as the son opens the door, her son, the judge's son, opens the door with her husband, Mark Anderville, stood behind. The guy just opens fire with a hail of bullets and kills her son. I suppose it doesn't really matter whether it was the judge that's killed or the son. There's a very clear message, a very clear mafia message being sent to the judge that if you try and pursue this court case, you're going to die, or people around you are going to die. So you better back off right now.
And also the guy who carried out the assassination then assassinated himself, supposedly, with 2 bullets in the head.
Allegedly, okay. Allegedly. Now, I've looked into this guy. He's the guy they've saying caused the assassination. The only person who, of course, will know that is can identify him is Mark, Judge Esther Salas' husband. And just looking at Roy Den Hollander, who's the guy who's accused of carrying out this assassination, dressed as a FedEx delivery driver in Rockland, New York, where Judge Esther Salas lives. He's actually a lawyer. He's an anti-feminist lawyer. He's got his own website, and he takes court cases, basically sort of Fathers for Justice type lawyer. It doesn't really sound to me as if a wealthy lawyer would really need to be a hitman for the mafia.
Well, it may be that he didn't do it, but his name is on the the charge sheet.
Well, one of the things Alex is talking about there is, well, if you're going to assassinate somebody, you've got to assassinate the assassin, and then you've got to assassinate the person who killed the assassin as well, in order to completely cover your tracks. So it might well be that the assassin has been killed. Who knows? But also someone else has been killed in order to fit them up as the assassin. Someone that whoever it is, maybe the mafia, wanted out of the way in the first place.
Well, I think it's
double whammy, I suppose.
I think it's pretty clear that there's more going on here than meets the eye. And as I say, Whitney Webb's research going back to the 1940s in the US, it's not new, this stuff. Relations between organised crime and intelligence services have been going on forever.
But particularly in this case, we're talking about Les Wexner and the Jewish mafia. I mean, should you call them the Jewish mafia, the Zionist mafia, the Israeli mafia? Who are these people?
Well, they are mafia, and they are some of the top people are Jewish, but I don't think they're very necessarily practicing Jews. A lot of mafia groups tend to have an ethnic basis because it's a basis of solidarity. There's an Albanian mafia, and of course Albanian's a rather obscure language. And therefore it's quite easy to keep things secret if you talk about it in Albanian, because nobody can understand what you're on about. And, it's the logic behind Cockney rhyming slang and all the rest of it. But when money's involved, you're bound to find that, all sorts of different people will be involved.
It might also be that Deutsche Bank are very, very nervous about all this coming out, especially since they're on a bit of a...
Well, Deutsche Bank is probably going to collapse, and it's probably the most over-leveraged bank in the world. And when it does, of course, it will pull down the financial system in an afternoon. It's pretty certain that's what's going to happen. I don't think whether you're a left-wing or a right-wing economist, nobody is supposed to just pump up the stock market like we've been doing for the last 10 years. It's bound to lead to a crash. There's nothing else that will happen.